Good afternoon. Governor Cooper has proclaimed May 2022 as Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and OSHR is excited to celebrate this afternoon with our guest speakers, Dr. Hao Wang and his son Micah Wang. They will discuss the 1871 LA Chinatown Massacre, described as the worst race lynching, mass race lynching on the West Coast. Before we further begin today's program, I would like to do some housekeeping. As always, please keep your microphones on mute throughout the entire session. Please send all of your questions to the chat room. The chat room will be monitored, and we will work to make sure your questions are answered in an orderly fashion. This session is being recorded, and you will be able to view this program later on demand. Speaking of on-demand recordings, all of our Lunch and Learn sessions are now available to view. The following webinars have most recently been added: Irish American Heritage Month and Women's History Month. So if you would like to view these recordings or any of our previous EEO virtual Lunch and Learn sessions, feel free to tune in. I will also be sending a note very soon notifying you that today's session is available to watch. May is an extremely busy month for us here, and we're pleased to announce the following Lunch and Learn sessions. May the 18th, Military Appreciation Month, 10 o'clock until 11:30, and May the 25th, Older Americans Month, 1 o'clock until 2 o'clock. We look forward to seeing you there. Again, we are celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I'm going to turn the program over to Gina Streety, and she's going to introduce today's speakers. Gina?
Thank you, Wendy. My mic didn't want to unmute. It is such an honor to introduce Dr. Wang and his son, Micah. It's been a pleasure working with them, and it's just a joy to do this. So Dr. Hao Wang is the Bessie and Cecil Frankel Endowed Chair in Music at Scripps College. He was a Fulbright Scholar in American Studies and Music to Eötvös-Loránd College, University in Budapest, Hungary, and served as a United States Information Agency Artistic Ambassador on several overseas tours to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Dr. Wang has performed in over 30 countries globally and has received numerous honors, awards, and grants, including from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Program, the National Endowment of the Arts, the UCLA Chancellor's Arts Initiative Program, the New York and Colorado Councils of the Arts, the California Meet the Composer Series. Publications include the Article of the Year Award of American Music Teacher Journal and other articles in refereed journals of Great Britain, Hungary, Greece, Japan, Russia, China, and the US. And that is just like the tip of what this great human being has accomplished. If you could see how thick his CV is. His work has been recognized on television, radio, and in print publications, including by the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Washington Post, Press Play with Madeline Brand on KCRW National Public Radio, Cinema Junkie with Beth Accomando on KPBS NPR, Now This News, and the largest distributor of news on social media, Air Talk with Larry Mintel, on KPCC, NPR's Morning Edition. There's just so much more I could share, but then we wouldn't have time for the program now, would we? To say he's accomplished is an understatement, and also accomplished is his incredible son, Micah, who is a musician and composer and writer. He has acted as a musical director for live events, including the 2021 and 2019 LA Chinatown Massacre commemorations in partnership with Scripps College, UCLA, and the Chinese American Museum of Los Angeles. The 2019 concert series, Under Our Skins, and Art Smooch 2018, featuring the poetry of Angie Estes at Scripps College. In 2021, Micah wrote and produced the podcast Blood on Gold Mountain, sponsored by Scripps College and the New England Conservatory, which gained recognition on a national stage. Micah has appeared on media outlets including KCRW, Now This News, KPBS, and the Los Angeles Daily News, among others. Micah was educated at Tufts University and Pitzer College, where he studied music, performing arts, and literature. And as an accomplished author and composer, he is influenced by a wide range of global perspectives. He spent much of his childhood accompanying his father on ethnomusicological field expeditions, and in 2014 co-authored a study on cross-cultural research with R. Lee Monroe. In 2013, Micah was a Fulbright Fellow in musicology, conducting experiential research and community outreach with practitioners of, and I'll say this right, I hope, Romungro Sagayan Zina, or Roman Gypsy music, in Budapest, Hungary. You all, we are in for quite a treat, and you have no idea the brilliance that we are privileged to have with us today. Thank you both, and Dr. Wong, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Gina, and I thank you, Wendy, also. We could not do this without you, so we've been looking forward to this. So I just want to thank all of you who have tuned in, so to speak, because by showing up, you show that you care about this issue, and it means a lot to me, not only personally, but because due to the twin pandemics of COVID and white supremacy, I sometimes worry how many people in the United States are suffering from what might be called compassion fatigue. Racist violence against Asian Americans that has been spurred on by anti-Chinese rhetoric during COVID has led to more than 10,000 reported cases of hate incidents against Asian Americans since COVID began. And knowing Asian culture as I do, I'm pretty sure that that's only the tip of the iceberg. Asian Americans just don't like to report things to authorities. I'll begin this meeting by exploring the roots of anti-Asian American violence that began in the 19th century on the West Coast up through to the present day. And here's something that I just want to share personally with you all. It was really only after having children that I realized I couldn't outrun anti-Asian racism because it was hurting my kids. And that eventually led to my finding out about the neglected history of the 1871 LA Chinatown Massacre, which is scarcely acknowledged in any US history textbooks, and certainly not taught in most schools and universities here in America. And this neglect, even erasure of the LA Chinatown Massacre, which was one of the bloodiest race riots on the West Coast, really the bloodiest documented race riot on the West Coast, is not just shocking, but also very concerning, because even in LA, in California, people just don't know about the lynching of at least 20 people in 2 hours by shooting, stabbing, hanging by a mob of about 500 people that amounted to about 1/5 the population, the male population in the town at the time. And that seems really incredibly callous. So here, why don't we go to the next slide? Next slide, please. Yes, great. Here's a picture of one of the early Chinese miners who came when they heard of the 1849 gold rush. Now, it took them too much time, so most Chinese were late to the Chinese gold rush, to the California gold rush. But this is one of those guys who made it, of course, 4 years late, but he made it. And the funny thing is that he might I recognize him. I wore my hair as long as he did when I was in college. My son does now. So it's no wonder that the first time I met a Navajo elder in the Southwest, she asked me, "What tribe are you from?" Next slide. So about 160 years ago, Governor Leland Stanford, founder of Stanford University, said many of the same things about Chinese as Mr. Trump did about Mexicans just a few years ago. To my mind, it is clear that the settlement among us of an inferior race is to be discouraged by every legitimate means. Asia, with her numberless millions, sends to our shores the dregs of her population. There can be no doubt but that the presence among us of numbers of degraded and distinct people must exercise a deleterious influence upon the superior race, and to a certain extent repel desirable immigration. Now, that was given at his inaugural address in 1862, but it could just as easily have been said by a past president about 5 years ago. So now next, please, slide. Now here is a picture of some members of that degraded race who helped build the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad, which in certain ways really knit together this country, west to east. And we have these people to thank for it, because they undertook the hardest and most dangerous jobs in terms of blowing up mountains and crossing rivers. Next, here's a photo of other Chinese Americans. Now, these guys don't look much like pushovers, and they are people from Los Angeles. And I think you had to be tough to survive out there in those days, in the 1800s, as a Chinese. Next. This is an old photogravure of where they lived. Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles de Porciuncula, segregated old Chinatown, where Chinese were forced to live. They were not allowed to live anywhere else, and of course, it was the worst part of town. Next. And here's how 1/5 of the population of that Chinatown wound up on the night of October 24th, 1871. Now, just 150 years plus ago. There are 17 bodies here, but there were nearly 20 people killed altogether that we know of. And yeah, you can't even recognize most of those bundles as bodies. But this is what the LA people saw the day afterwards. On the morning of 25th, they were just dumped in the courtyard of the LA jail. Next. This is what the New York Times wrote about the massacre: War of the Races. Now, the problem with the War of the Races is that this war was very one-sided. There was no one who was killed who was involved in the shooting. There was a shooting of one person, and I'll just sketch out exactly what some facts, and Micah will tell you the whole story on Blood on Gold Mountain. But it starts with a feud of honor and power in Chinatown between two opposing Chinese gangs who we call Tongs. And the first person to die on October 24th, which was the day of the massacre, was a highbinder who was a Tong soldier. When a police officer found this highbinder dying on the street, he left him to run into Wing Chung's store, where there was a chest full of gold and silver. Now, this policeman knew it was illegal for Chinese to testify in court against whites. So if a Guila, which is Chinese for white, were to commit a crime against a Chinese, for example, to help himself to a Chinaman's treasure, he would be immune to any sort of legal consequences. So when policeman Jesus Bilderan burst through the door of Wing Chung, he wasn't looking for justice. He was looking for gold. And what he found was Tong boss Sam Yuan. The two men fired at the same time. Bilderman staggered back through the door, shot through the shoulder. Falling to his knees, Jesus blew his whistle, and a friend named Robert Thompson responded to this whistle by running up to the entrance of the building. Thompson wasn't a cop. In fact, he had been the owner of one of the town's most notorious saloons, the Blue Wing. When Thompson rushed to the door, he stuck his pistol inside and fired blindly into the dark interior, despite the fact that there were women and children inside the store. Pulling open the door to go inside, he took a bullet to the chest. He died an hour later, around 7 p.m. Years later, Horace Bell, a white lawyer who was an early chronicler of LA, wrote that he believed Bilderman and Thompson went to Yuen's store that day for no other purpose than to steal his gold. Now, I just want to emphasize that Robert Thompson was the first white man killed by Chinese immigrants in LA, even though there had been decades of racist violence against Chinese. Within an hour of Thompson's death, over 500 heavily armed men gathered in the alley, which is where Chinatown was, to take their revenge. That comprised 1/5 of all the men in LA at the time. All hell broke loose. The lynch mob killed around 20 Chinese in 2 hours, indiscriminately grabbing people off the street who had nothing to do with Thompson's shooting. These included Chinese Dr. Jean Tong, who was dragged out of his house. He had treated Anglos and Mexicans whenever they needed his help. And when he begged for his life in English and Spanish, someone in the mob responded by shooting him in the mouth. Someone else cut off his finger to steal his diamond ring. Other people, musicians, cooks, shopkeepers, even a 14-year-old boy who had been in America for only 1 week, were lynched. That means shot, hung, stabbed, whatever they wanted to do to them. By 9 p.m., all over Chinatown, the bodies of hanged men swayed in the flickering torchlight. An hour later, the scene changed from mob violence to ghoulish revelry. The nearby saloons and restaurants in town overflowed with men from the lynch mobs whose leaders competed in boasting about how many men they had killed. Although there were hundreds of eyewitnesses, only 8 people were convicted of manslaughter at the local trial, and just a few months later, the California Supreme Court overturned all the convictions on the basis of a legal technicality. So the killers all walked free. And the podcast that Micah created by composing and writing the script, Blood on Gold Mountain, was created to help people remember what happened, because sympathy is not enough. Empathy has to come from wanting to learn about what happened to other people, because it matters to us personally. So now I'm just going to cruise through a little bit what happened the next 30 years after the LA Chinatown massacre. So next slide, please. So this is the leader of the Working Men's Party of California 6 years later. We intend to try and vote the Chinaman out, to frighten him out. And if this won't do, we will kill him out. We are going to arm ourselves to the teeth. The heathen slaves must leave this country. If it costs 10,000 lives, well, they'd gotten a good start with 20 in LA. Next, the 1877 San Francisco race riots were a 3-day pogrom. On July 23rd, anti-Chinese riots started when 8,000 people gathered in the vacant sand lot in front of City Hall that quickly turned to a racist mob who killed at least 4 Chinese. Of course, no one was convicted of any of the murders. Next, so how did the media cover this? Well, that's how, all right? Next, in 1880, anti-Chinese sentiment spread to Colorado, and a race riot in Denver comprised of about 3,000 people ransacking or burning much of Chinatown there, and many were shouting, "Stamp out the yellow plague." So the razing of the Chinese ghetto ensued, and very few Chinese came back, not surprisingly. Next, the maelstrom of anti-Chinese sentiment culminated in 1882 when President Chester Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, suspending Chinese immigration for 10 years and declaring Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization. The Chinese were the first group identified by race and class for severely limited legal entry and ineligibility for citizenship. Widespread anti-Chinese sentiment continued to be directed towards those people, Chinese still there, especially in the West. In 1902, Chinese immigration was made permanently illegal. The Exclusion Act wasn't fully dismantled until 1965, which is 83 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act. Next slide, sorry. The 1885 Wyoming Rock Springs Massacre is one of the bloodiest massacres, but it took place in Wyoming, not on the West Coast. There was a fight that broke out between white and Chinese miners in the number 6 mine in Rock Springs, and it turned into a mob killing. The mob moved into what was Chinatown in the mine town, pulling some Chinese men from their homes and shooting others as they came into the street. White women took part in the killings as well. It's documented. The mob looted shacks and houses and set them on fire. It's estimated that at least 30 to 40 Chinese miners were killed that day. Next, in 1885, there were an estimated 950 Chinese in Seattle. It was roughly 10% of the city's population. But when America started struggling with hard economic times in the mid-1880s, Caucasian workers, most of whom were immigrants themselves, came to view the Chinese as threats to them for the few available jobs. The Chinese were said to be willing to work for lower wages, though in fact they had no choice in the matter because the employers just paid them lower wages. So the city's better elements, led by Judge Thomas Burke and Mayor Henry Yesler, agreed that the Chinese had to go. The question was how. The riots ended in the deaths of at least 4 people. And here's something which I think very few people know about. Next slide, please. In May 1887, in Hell's Canyon, by the Oregon side of Snake River, as many as 34 Chinese gold miners were ambushed and murdered by a gang of white horse thieves and schoolboys. News accounts reported that the bodies showed evidence of torture. No one was punished for the crime. Next. I don't think I need to make any comments about this. Next. The U.S. Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, is important because it rules, or there was a famous dissent against the constitutionality of racial segregation laws. And Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote that in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There's no caste here. And yet, he also described the Chinese as a race so different that we cannot admit them as citizens to our country. Okay. Then next, this is the yellow peril, sorry, not pearl. Of course, it's a violent Chinese guy in a ponytail standing over a dying white woman. There were very few white women who were killed by Chinese, I can tell you. The opposite, maybe not so much. And I'll leave you with this one. Next. This was advertised as a candy in the 1920s. So that's like less than 100 years ago. The Coolies candy. And you can see how they advertised it. Anyway, that ends my presentation, and I'll hand it over to Micah, who will be talking about the podcast Blood on Gold Mountain.
Hello. I am just so thankful to be here, to have the opportunity to talk to all of you about, you know, the work that we've been doing to try and tell these stories. Thank you so much, Gina, for just being so kind and helpful and getting us here to have this opportunity. So now that we have had an overview of some of the history, a little bit of we have kind of seen as our part to try and respond to that history and respond to the uh, social context within which we're operating right now, not only historical, but in terms of current events and in terms of where things kind of feel like they're headed, maybe for the future. And I think that for me, the main thing that I feel like is important to try and accomplish when confronting these types of issues, you know, racism, cultural disconnection, is to try and give people from different backgrounds the opportunity to be exposed to each other's humanity and each other's culture in relatable ways. I think in certain ways, it's ironic to do a project whose deepest goal is building cultural dialogue, um, when its subject matter is cultural conflict, like the case of the LA Chinatown massacre. But the way that I kind of see it in this country and to, you know, kind of also just in this world, I think a lot of history, a lot of big, memorable, and dramatic events are connected to this continually evolving kind of dynamic between insiders and outsiders, between people who think that they're better and people who they think are worse. And I think that that manifests itself, you know, so many different ways in so many different parts of history. And I think that among people in the United States who have experienced what it feels like to be attacked or marginalized or, you know, excluded from opportunities because of race or culture or other things that kind of come down to you from your ancestors without your willing it, you know, that just are. Um, I kind of saw like really telling this story as an opportunity to reach out and be like, hey, like this is a familiar story in certain ways. In certain ways, it's a quintessential American story, you know, like to be here and to be in relation to, uh, you know, a kind of cultural center, which you could call white America or Anglo America or whatever that happens to be within the little pocket that you happen to be occupying, and to fall afoul of that regime. Um, so a big part of what makes the story compelling, though, is how people respond. I think that there's in the media and stuff, there's a lot of emphasis on like these are the bad things that happened, and this is why they were wrong, and that's kind of the whole story in a lot of cases. And I think that that actually misses a lot of like, you know, so these things happen. You know, we run into prejudice or we run into violence in the course of our lives, in different ways depending on who we are, and the ways that we respond to those things makes up a huge part of who we are and how we live. And so with Blood on Gold Mountain, instead of it being about the massacre per se, what it really is it's about the people and the stories who were involved in the massacre and before, and, you know, well, we didn't really get to after Blood on Gold Mountain, but and kind of like how the human spirit responds to those kinds of circumstances. So if I could get the next slide, then I'll just do a quick overview of like the plot of Blood on Gold Mountain. So the main character of Blood on Gold Mountain is a young woman whose name is Yet Ho, which is kind of an anglicization of probably some one of the South Chinese languages that are either Cantonese or Cantonese adjacent, which is different from the dominant language of Mandarin that's spoken in modern China, because we're talking about a very different China. And so Yat Ho arrives in California because there was a huge war in southern China at that time. About 20 million people were killed in that war, and more displaced, and then another 10 million died because of the resulting famine. And that war actually is a huge part of what drove the first wave of Chinese immigration to the United States, because labor contractors from the United States would pick up refugees, give them contracts which are basically indentured servant type situations, and then bring them over, which is actually one of the reasons why the word coolie, which means sold muscle, and the idea that the Chinese were being imported to kind of substitute for slaves who had been recently freed was a big rhetorical thing that anti-immigration people would say. They were like, oh, they're bringing in slaves and driving down wages. So Yat Ho's part of that wave of migration, and she comes to California and she meets up with her brother who's involved in the gang life, which was pretty much one of the more profitable ways that Chinese people could live, but it was also very dangerous. And together they go to Los Angeles, where Yat Ho has been contracted to marry a merchant. Unfortunately, her brother goes back to San Francisco, leaving her with her new husband, and she doesn't really get along with her new husband. He's a lot older. He is involved in prostitution, and it's just not a good situation for her. But she does meet a young man who works in her husband's house sometimes, named Li Yong, and they begin to have a love affair together. And eventually they decide that they're going to run away together. And that's kind of when the real trouble starts, because Li Yong is associated with one of the two major gangs in Chinatown. And this is all based on historical facts, the characters and stuff, but like Li Yong is associated with one of the gangs, and Yat Ho's husband is associated with the other gang. So when Li Yong and Yat Ho decide to run off together, they enlist the help of the gang that Li Yong is associated with, which was called the Hong Chao Tong. And that escape creates an honor problem for the other gang, which is called the Ziyep Company, or it went by a bunch of other names, but mostly we called it the Ziyep Company in Blood on Gold Mountain. So basically, they successfully escape at first, but there's this big intrigue with the gangs, kind of both trying to capture them. Yat Ho ends up in jail. The gang that helped them escape gets them out of jail, and they finally make their way out of Los Angeles. But at that point, the fight between the gangs is so intense that there's shooting in the street, and then the story of the massacre results when the leader of one of the gangs is forced by the government to demonstrate that he has a certain amount of money in a treasure chest. And then the police arrive at his store to try and take to appropriate the treasure chest. And the violence that led to the massacre ensues from there. So the kind of the story is mostly just about how these people respond to this crazy situation. It's very much a reimagining. There's not a ton of historical material about how people felt or what they thought. There's just historical material on what they did. And I would like to show you a couple of sound samples from the podcast, which is quite long, but this first one is an introduction to the leader of one of the gangs in LA. The first time that Yuk-Ho meets that gang leader who's going to play a very prominent role in the drama later. Could we hear that audio? Great, thank you. So that's like kind of a picture of these Chinese gangster types like the ones that we saw in that photo earlier. And they really were kind of the only Chinese people who had any kind of power because, like a lot of other people in the United States at that time, the Chinese didn't have any legal status. Your capacity for violence to protect yourself or attack others, was, I think, very, very important in terms of your ability to take care of yourself. And I think that to a great extent, that's just the story of this country. That's oversimplification, but I think that situation is kind of what led to a lot of the tension and danger in this particular story. So can I have the next slide? So this next audio sample is the introduction to the backstory of Li Yong, who is the young man with whom Yuk-Ho is having a love affair. This is just an overview of like what they talk about in the weeks after kind of like establishing their connection. And it has everything to do with how Li Yong came to be in Los Angeles, going back to the previous generation and his family, which kind of touches on a little bit on the dynamics in China at that time. Can we hear that audio? Um, Great, thank you. Um, so unfortunately, you know, at the end of the story, we have no choice but to engage with the fact of the massacre. And I think, like any traumatic, violent event of that kind, there's a lot of emotional weight to that. And I think that what I tried to do with that part of Blood on Gold Mountain was just to really lean into an almost, it's like almost a, I don't want to say celebration, but it's an honoring of the love and kind of human experience and strength to a certain extent that goes into grieving. Um, because I think that, you know, when these bad things happen, to us or to people we know or just to other people that we hear about, you know, now or in other times, like, I think that there's only a certain extent to which we can do anything about it materially, especially like when someone's dead, they're gone, you know, like from this world. But like the way that we respond to that internally is really important, and I do kind of believe in a deep way as something that connects all of us because all of us face that reality one way or another. So if we can see the next slide. Um, So yeah, can we get the thank you. So this is just another picture of a Chinese I think that he's a worker in San Francisco or something posing for a for a photo, and I just thought it was good to kind of look into the face of, you know, somebody from that place-ish and time while we hear this, which is the doctor who my dad had mentioned, who was one of the victims of the massacre, is kind of an important character in the Blood on Gold Mountain story. And this is the scene, this audio that we're going to hear is the scene where he and his wife, Tong Yo is the name of his wife, and Tong Jin is the doctor's name, are ambushed in their house by the lynch mob. They don't know that the lynch mob is happening because they weren't involved in the gang conflict, but that doesn't really make that much of a difference. So if we can hear that audio, then that will conclude my part of the presentation about Blood on Gold Mountain. Great. Thank you so much. That's all. That's all from me about Blood on Gold Mountain. I think, are we gonna have some question and answers now, or I don't know whether Gina or Wendy like can direct us what to do.
Yeah, I did get one question I hope you can see. It was emailed to me. Someone wants to know, why was this violence so prevalent in the West?
Micah, do you want to take it or?
Sure. I mean, I can start. I think that um, I think that in the West there was a very strong culture of kind of rugged, self-sufficient violence, like if you kind of think back to the fact that, settlers coming out of the United States, which, was kind of mostly an East Coast establishment for a long time, coming out west, killing the people who lived there as best as they could, and kind of grabbing whatever they could get, was kind of, that's like, to kind of quote the adage, how the West was won, was with the what Winchester rifles and Colt pistols, and I think that um, it wasn't just against the Chinese by any means that this violence was taking place. It was just, there was violence and war between the colonial establishments of Mexico and the United States, in California. So that's kind of a mix of Spanish and indigenous people fighting a mix of, American identified people from a mix of cultures. And then as migrant labor, whether that was from China, whether that was from elsewhere in Asia, or whether that was from other parts of Mexico or Central America, kind of became more in demand, and people started importing laborers, basically. Uh, then the violence kind of washed over them too, because it really was this kind of thing where, like, it was the rule of the gun, the rule of of force, in the West, and to a certain extent, right, throughout the United States. Same old story.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd like to just add one thing or two things. One is Mao once says power comes from the barrel of a gun. And, that's still true, I think, today. And then the other thing is there were only 6 to 7 policemen in the whole town of LA. So there weren't a lot of people trying to keep the law. And then as the story shows, a number of those policemen were trying to enforce any laws at all. They were in it for themselves. They were trying to grab what they could, so it was a free-for-all in certain ways, I think.
They were just another rival gang, just like they are, now. Like, yeah.
Wendy, if you get questions, you can feel free to interrupt me. Go
I
ahead.
have a question. I have not received one from the chat, but this is a question that I have for you, for either one of you. It seems like, well, I heard you say that little was done at the end of the events as far as getting people charged for these murders. And I just wanted to know if there have been any efforts to gain reparations for the victims of this massacre, or have there been any efforts to get an acknowledgement of the event or public apology?
Well, I think actually Mike and I participated in the 150th in a commemoration last year of the 150th anniversary of what happened. Up until then, there had not been a public monument to what happened. We actually performed in the area this massacre took place, because old Chinatown now is under Union Station, which is the Amtrak train station in LA. It was just totally bulldozed. And that's a good way to erase history too, because it's literally underneath concrete and asphalt right now. But also know not only were there no reparations talk, but there wasn't until last year, there wasn't even an official statement by the mayor about what had happened. So I think in many ways, a lot of Asian American history has simply been neglected because, one, there's just not enough Asian Americans, or there weren't enough Asian Americans to really constitute a political force of any kind. And two, in many ways, part of the burden of being the model minority is being told, you have enough, we've done enough for you, just go away. You should be grateful for what you have.
Can I jump in there though? I think that the model minority myth is a very pernicious thing that it's not, there's no real truth
Mhm.
to it. It's just something that's designed to separate Asian Americans who are small, not numerous, but if could be part of coalitions,
Right.
with other people who have certain aspects of the situation that are parallel, and just as that the kind of I think that there still is this pattern of this kind of divisive rhetoric in the media that's trying to be oh well, this is issues that's specific to you, or this is issues that's specific to you, kind of to keep people from being hey, wait a minute, if we all have kind of these parallel issues that actualize in different ways, and I think that kind of erasing history and making up narratives in a kind of divide and conquer way has been a very effective way for people who are maybe in power and don't want to put themselves in the position of having to deal with engaging with some of these things, just whichever ones of these things, these historical or continuing wrongs that they could avoid engaging with, they will, right? Because it's expensive and difficult and politically challenging potentially. But yeah, I think that we really want to move away from giving any credence to the
Right.
minority
Right.
myth. That's just not helpful.
Yeah, it is a stereotype, that is a ploy. I mean, thanks, Micah, for clarifying what I was meaning. And even now, for instance, in New York, if you divide people by the specific, what they call them by categories, that it's actually within the New York metropolitan area, the category, the racial category, ethnic category that has the least education, has the least income, is actually people who are categorized as Asian Americans. They're not necessarily the rich mainlanders from the PRC, but people from Laos, from the Hmong people there, because Asian American itself is just such a broad kind of coalition of different peoples. And frankly, even Chinese, there's a huge difference between Southerners and Northerners. I mean, Mike and I were part Hakka, which is a tribe that was pushed out of northern China into southern China, and our name means guest people. And only in China could you be a guest person for over 1,000, for 1,200 years. We've been called the guest people because honestly, nobody wanted us. The Northerners got rid of us, and then the Southerners didn't want us there. So, so it's just really important, I think, to, as Micah is saying, is to break through these kind of monoliths, these kind of, stereotypes, because it is a way to kind of distance people, right? Divide and conquer, or just distance ourselves emotionally, because it's just people become one of them instead of one of us, which is, there's the human race, and we are all part of that. So it's a good way to bypass that, I think.
In our closing minutes, I don't want us to miss an opportunity to hear what's coming up next for you two, what you're working on now. I know you're very busy, but there's a lot of great stuff happening, right?
Yes. Micah, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So we are working on a special release thing that's going to be on the podcast feed of Blood on Gold Mountain, which is, you know, like on all the major streaming platforms and stuff. And this is mostly, I think, to continue the work and also kind of as a thank you to those people who kind of been you know with us through the journey of Blood on Gold Mountain as listeners at various times and places. But like the new thing is actually it's a play with like with a cast, and it's actually Dad wrote this one, and I perform in it, but also just like producing the audio, and it's kind of drawing. Well, Dad, maybe you can describe like what the play is like.
Well, I'm still trying to figure it out, even as the author, but it's really trying. It's called Genshi, which is perseverance, and it's in many ways it's kind of what we've had to do is persevere. You know, I think many people who were not part of the mainstream had to persevere. That was the strength that we had, right? It wasn't like we were welcomed, but we had to persevere, and that's our strength is perseverance through, and it's an acknowledgement of what happened. So it's 100 years span, a little over 100 years span in California from 1900, the bubonic plague in San Francisco, which the Chinese were blamed for, just as they're being blamed for COVID now. And then just last year, an Asian American veteran was attacked and very, very severely injured when as his attackers were screaming and calling him China virus in China. So in many ways, there's this historical, just this incredible historical balance that in 1900 you have people calling Chinese the China virus or calling bubonic plague the China virus, and then or China plague, sorry, and then now people calling COVID the China virus. So it in certain ways, how much have things changed? You know, the Chinese are still being blamed for disease. Um, and so that's, that was something that I was thinking about. But again, we turned it to historical fiction. So we're trying to give a sense of the families. In the first act, it's about San Francisco, but it's brother and sister, their relationship. And then in the second act, it's 2021. And again, it's a family, it's a Chinese family, this time between the veteran and his mom. And I actually it may sound weird, but I almost had fun writing about, I know from direct experience what it's like dealing with a Chinese mom. And so I was able to write some of that stuff in there because of course she's never satisfied. But that's just something that I was able to share in the play. So it was actually, even though it's a tough situation, it's trying to share some humanity with people so that you recognize, oh yeah, that's the way moms like to do what they do to their sons, sometimes. Why can't you? What is wrong with you? And so even when his face has gotten bashed in, that's sometimes what happens, right? And so so we've been doing that, and we may be the NEA thing. Mike, you want to talk about that, or why don't you talk about the NEA thing?
Yeah, we're doing another live performance this fall, like with the support of the National Endowment of the Arts, which is kind of again trying to place current events within the context of history and trying to work on building coalitions and reaching out on the basis of our experience to connect to other people from other backgrounds, whether that's different Asian American backgrounds or different backgrounds completely, like in this society, because we really do believe that one of the silver linings of these kinds of hardships, these kind of continuous and evolving hardships, is that so many people go through similar things, and the more that we can communicate about that and share that experience, you know, across lines of culture and like kind of even language and what have you, the kind of more that we'll feel connected to each other. And that's really the ultimate goal, I think, for us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for hosting us.
Well, Dr. Wong and Micah, I would just like to thank you both for coming and giving us this presentation today. It was very informative and very engaging. I learned a lot about an event that, you know, I didn't even know existed. And so thank you for preserving that part of history for people so that they can learn about it and exposing that to us, especially during Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And on behalf of the Office of State Human Resources, again, I would just like to thank you for taking times out of your schedule to come and speak to us today and informing us about this event. And we wish you luck with everything that you have coming up in the future in regards to into this podcast that you have. And I would like to just again thank everyone for attending today's event and look to hear from us on May the 18th for Military Appreciation Month and May the 25th for Older Americans Month for those Lunch and Learn celebrations that we will have during the month of May. And until then, I would just like to say to take the time out to enjoy the remainder of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Thank you, and this concludes our